Your baby has my brother's eyes." The words were spoken so quietly that for a moment Elena Brooks wondered if she had imagined them. But when she looked up, the man standing in front of her was still there, tall, composed, and utterly immovable, blocking the only exit from the library like a living wall. Adrian Romano did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. Men like him had a way of filling a room with silence without saying anything at all. Elena tightened her hold on the small bundle in her arms, instinctively drawing the baby closer to her chest, as if her body alone could shield him from whatever storm had just entered the room. The Romano estate was known across the city for its polished marble floors, towering windows, and quiet wealth that seemed to hum beneath every chandelier. But tonight the mansion felt smaller than it ever had before, the heavy oak shelves of the library pressing in from all sides, as if the walls themselves were listening. Elena had come here only to finish her shift. 3 months of cleaning rooms, polishing railings, and staying invisible had taught her the most important rule of working in a place like this: never attract the attention of the man who owned it. Yet now Adrian Romano stood less than 3 feet away from her, his sharp gray eyes focused not on her face, but on the child in her arms. The baby shifted slightly, making the soft, restless sound of a sleepy infant, unaware of the tension hanging in the air like an electrical current before a storm. Adrian's gaze did not waver. For several long seconds, he simply studied the child, his expression unreadable, as if he were examining a detail in a painting only he could see. Elena felt her heartbeat climb into her throat. She had heard the stories whispered by the other staff when they thought she wasn't listening. Stories about the Romano family, about the empire built behind quiet doors and careful smiles. Stories about Adrian Romano himself, a man who rarely spoke more than necessary and whose decisions were never questioned twice. None of those stories had prepared her for the strange calm in his voice when he finally spoke again. "I noticed it the first week," he said slowly, almost to himself. "The color, the shape." Elena swallowed hard, confusion mixing with fear. She shifted her weight slightly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Sir, I'm sorry if I shouldn't be in here. I was just heading back to the staff wing." Adrian didn't move. If anything, he leaned a fraction closer, his attention still locked on the baby's face. The soft lamplight from the desk beside them reflected faintly in the infant's eyes, revealing a pale silver-gray color that seemed unusually bright against his warm brown skin. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My brother," he said after a moment, his voice quieter than before, "had eyes exactly like that." Elena felt the words hit her like cold water. For a second she couldn't breathe. She had never heard Adrian Romano speak about family. In fact, the staff rarely heard him speak about anything personal at all. Yet now his gaze lifted slowly from the baby and settled on her, steady and searching, as if he were trying to read the truth directly from her thoughts. "Tell me something, Ms. Brooks," he said calmly, his voice carrying that same quiet authority that made the entire household hold its breath whenever he entered a room. "Where did you meet Lucas Romano?" Elena felt the question settle into the room like a weight that pressed against her chest, making the air suddenly harder to breathe. For a moment, she simply stared at Adrian Romano, unsure whether she had heard him correctly. The name he had spoken sounded unfamiliar and yet strangely close, like a word she should recognize but could not quite place. Her fingers tightened around the soft blanket wrapped around the baby as she instinctively rocked him once, the gentle motion that usually calmed him when he stirred. The child shifted in her arms, blinking slowly under the warm glow of the library lamps, completely unaware that the quiet world around him had just tilted. Elena forced herself to answer, though her voice came out smaller than she intended. "I do not know anyone named Lucas Romano, sir." Adrian did not interrupt her. He simply watched her with the same careful attention he had given the baby moments earlier. The silence stretched between them, long enough that Elena could hear the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted above the fireplace and the distant hum of the mansion's heating system pushing warm air through the vents. She wished desperately that she could disappear back into the safe invisibility she had maintained for the past 3 months, but there was no stepping around Adrian Romano once he had decided to stand in your path. His expression remained calm, but something in his eyes had sharpened slightly, as though he were listening not only to her words, but to everything she was not saying. "You are certain," he said quietly. It was not quite a question and not quite an accusation either. Elena swallowed, trying to steady the sudden rush of memories that had begun to surface at the edges of her thoughts. There had been a man once. A kind man who had smiled easily and spoke with a calm confidence that made people trust him even when they had just met him. But that man had never used the name Lucas Romano. The man I knew did not tell me his last name, she said slowly, choosing each word with care. Adrian's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, as if a piece of information had clicked into place in his mind. Elena noticed it even though the movement was barely there. He had been expecting something like that. The realization made her pulse quicken again. "Where did you meet him?" Adrian asked, his tone still controlled but more focused now. Elena hesitated, glancing briefly toward the tall windows that framed the far wall of the library. Outside, the dark grounds of the estate stretched into the quiet distance, the garden lights glowing softly across the manicured lawns. For a moment she wished she were back in the small neighborhood shelter where her life had been simple and predictable, long before she had ever stepped foot inside this mansion. "At a community shelter downtown," she said at last. "He volunteered there on weekends." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly, as if he were replaying something in his mind. Elena continued before fear could stop her. "He helped repair broken furniture and organize food deliveries. Everyone liked him. He was patient with people who needed help." The baby made a small sound again, stretching one tiny hand free from the blanket. Adrian's gaze dropped to the child instantly. The little fingers curled and uncurled in the air before settling back against the blanket. And for the briefest moment Elena saw something unexpected flicker across Adrian Romano's face. It was not anger. It was not suspicion. Either. It looked almost like recognition. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but heavy with thought. "My brother volunteered at a shelter exactly like that," he said. The words seemed to echo softly through the library. Elena's heart skipped. The man she remembered had once mentioned having a brother, though he had never shared details. At the time she had assumed it was simply a piece of conversation meant to fill the quiet moments between sorting donations and stacking boxes of canned food. Now Adrian Romano was standing in front of her telling her that the child in her arms carried the same eyes as his brother, and suddenly the past no longer felt like a distant memory. It felt like a door that had just begun to open. Elena felt the quiet in the library deepen after Adrian spoke those words, as if the room itself had begun listening more carefully. She shifted the baby slightly against her shoulder, gently adjusting the blanket around his small body while her thoughts struggled to keep up with what was unfolding. The man she had known had never mentioned the name Romano. He had introduced himself simply as Luke, with an easy smile and the calm patience of someone who preferred helping quietly rather than standing at the center of attention. At the time Elena had assumed he was just another volunteer trying to give back to the community. Now the possibility that he had been connected to the powerful family whose mansion she cleaned every day made her pulse quicken with confusion. Adrian Romano remained perfectly still, but Elena could sense the intensity of his focus as clearly as if it were a physical pressure in the room. His gaze moved once more to the baby's face, watching the slow blink of pale gray eyes that reflected the warm lamplight. The resemblance he saw was unmistakable to him. Elena could tell that much even without understanding the full weight of what it meant. "How long did you know him?" Adrian asked after a moment, his voice measured and thoughtful rather than demanding. Elena took a slow breath. The memories came back to her with surprising clarity, as if the quiet room had opened a window into another time. "Almost 6 months," she said softly. "He started volunteering at the shelter last winter. At first he only came on Saturdays to help move boxes and repair broken shelves. After a while he began staying longer." Adrian listened without interrupting, his expression revealing nothing but attention. Elena continued, her voice growing steadier as the memories unfolded. "He always arrived early in the morning, usually carrying coffee for the staff. He said the place reminded him that the world could still be simple if people helped each other." The words felt strange now, echoing inside a mansion where everything spoke of power and control rather than simplicity. The baby stirred again, making a soft, sleepy sound before settling back into the warmth of Elena's shoulder. Adrian watched the small movement carefully, and for a brief moment the tension in his face softened in a way Elena would not have expected from a man with his reputation. "Did he ever speak about his family?" Adrian asked quietly. Elena hesitated, searching her memory. Only a little, she admitted. He once mentioned that he had a brother who carried a lot of responsibility. He said his brother believed in protecting the people close to him, even when the world made that difficult. Adrian's eyes shifted slightly, as if the words had struck a familiar chord. Elena noticed the subtle reaction and realized that the conversation she had once considered ordinary now carried a meaning she had never understood before. He never told me his full name, she continued. He said names sometimes came with complications. The sentence hung in the air between them. Adrian slowly turned his gaze back toward her, and Elena could see the careful calculations forming behind his calm expression. Lucas always believed he could step away from certain responsibilities, Adrian said at last, his voice carrying a quiet weight that suggested long memories. But he never explained to me where he went when he disappeared on those weekends. Elena felt a chill move through her chest. The man she had known had never spoken about disappearing from anywhere. To her, he had simply been present, steady and warm during those long winter mornings when the shelter filled with people searching for food, blankets, or simply someone willing to listen. Adrian looked down at the baby once more, studying the gentle rise and fall of the child's breathing. Tell me something else, he said calmly. When was the last time you saw him? The question lingered in the quiet room, and Elena realized that. The answer might change everything she thought she knew about the past. Elena felt her throat tighten as Adrian's question settled into the quiet room, because the answer was not something she had thought about in months, and yet the memory returned with painful clarity the moment he asked. She shifted the baby gently in her arms, brushing a hand over the soft blanket as she searched for the right words. Early spring, she said at last, her voice softer now as if speaking too loudly might disturb the fragile past she was describing. It was a Saturday morning, just like the others. Adrian remained silent, watching her with the same careful attention he had shown since the conversation began. Elena continued slowly, allowing the memory to unfold piece by piece. The shelter had been crowded that morning, filled with families who had come in from the cold and volunteers moving between tables stacked with canned food and warm clothing. Luke had arrived carrying 2 cardboard trays of coffee cups balanced carefully in his hands, smiling in the easy way that had made everyone trust him within minutes of meeting him. He had joked with the staff about the weather, helped repair a loose leg on one of the folding tables, and spent nearly an hour patiently showing a group of children how to build small wooden birdhouses from spare pieces of lumber. Elena remembered watching him from across the room, noticing how naturally he listened when people spoke to him, how he never seemed rushed even when the shelter filled with noise and movement. That morning he had seemed quieter than usual though, thoughtful in a way she had not noticed before. At one point he had stepped outside into the narrow alley behind the building, and when Elena followed a few minutes later to throw out a bag of broken cardboard boxes, she had found him standing near the back door looking up at the gray sky, as if he were measuring the weight of something only he could see. Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly when she described the moment, but he still did not interrupt. Elena took a breath and continued. He told me he might have to leave for a while, she said. He said there were things he had to settle before he could come back to the shelter. The memory still carried the quiet sadness she had felt that day, though at the time she had not fully understood it. Luke had smiled gently as he spoke, but there had been a seriousness in his eyes that did not match the calm warmth he usually carried. Elena remembered asking him when he would return, and he had answered with a small shrug and a soft laugh, the kind people use when they do not want to promise something they cannot control. Adrian lowered his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the meaning behind those words. Elena continued speaking before the silence could swallow the moment. That was the last time I saw him, she said quietly. He helped carry supplies back inside, said goodbye to the staff, and walked out the front door. The baby stirred again in her arms, his small fingers curling slightly as he shifted against the blanket. Adrian looked down at the child, his expression tightening in a way that suggested the past Elena described was aligning with memories of his own. For several seconds he did not speak. When he finally lifted his head again, his voice had grown quieter but carried a new gravity that filled the library with a different kind of tension. Lucas disappeared that same week, he said slowly. The words seemed to settle into the room like a final piece falling into place. Elena felt the meaning ripple through her chest as the truth she had never imagined began to take shape in front of her. The words seemed to echo in Elena's mind long after Adrian finished speaking, as if the quiet library had repeated them back to her from every shadowed corner of the room. Lucas disappeared that same week. She felt the meaning of that sentence settle slowly into her chest, heavy and unsettling, because it connected two pieces of her life that had never touched before tonight. For months, she had believed that the man she knew as Luke had simply walked away from the shelter and from her life without explanation. It had hurt, but she had eventually accepted it as one more quiet disappointment in a world that rarely explained itself. Now Adrian Romano stood in front of her telling her that the same man had vanished completely, and the calm certainty in his voice made it impossible to dismiss the connection forming between past and present. Elena lowered her eyes toward the baby resting against her shoulder. The child breathed softly, unaware of the weight of the conversation unfolding above him. His small hand had slipped free of the blanket again, the tiny fingers curling slightly in the warm air. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. His attention followed the child's face with the same quiet intensity he had shown since the beginning of their conversation. There was no accusation in his expression now, only a deep concentration that suggested he was placing memories beside what he saw in front of him. Lucas stopped answering calls 3 days after that. Adrian said slowly, as if speaking more to the room than to Elena herself. At first I assumed he needed space. He had always been the one who believed the world could be gentler than the life we grew up in. The faintest trace of something reflective crossed his face before it faded again behind the controlled calm that defined him. Elena listened carefully, realizing that she was hearing something deeply personal about the man standing in front of her, something the rest of the household probably never heard. Adrian continued after a brief pause. When he did not return home, I sent people to look for him. No one could find where he had gone. Elena felt a quiet chill move through her chest. The memory of Luke standing in the alley behind the shelter came back to her again, the thoughtful look in his eyes as he spoke about needing to settle things before returning. At the time she had assumed he meant work, family, or some ordinary complication in life. Now the moment felt different, as if he had been standing at the edge of a decision far larger than she understood. Adrian slowly walked a few steps toward the tall window at the end of the library, his posture straight and composed. For a moment, he looked out across the dark lawn where the garden lights glowed softly along the stone paths. The mansion was silent at this hour, the distant hallways empty except for the quiet presence of security and staff. Elena remained where she stood, unsure whether she should speak or simply wait for him to finish the thoughts forming behind his steady expression. After several seconds, Adrian turned back toward her. His eyes moved once again to the baby's face, studying the child, with a level of attention that felt almost protective rather than suspicious. Lucas never mentioned a woman from the shelter, he said quietly, but he also never told me everything he was doing during those weekends. Elena felt a sudden wave of uncertainty. She had never expected the past to reach forward into the present like this. She had come to the Romano estate only to earn a steady paycheck and build a quiet life for her child. Yet the man standing in front of her was now looking at the baby in her arms, as if he were seeing something far more significant than a housekeeper's son. Adrian took a slow breath, his voice lowering slightly when he spoke again. "How old is the child?" Elena hesitated only briefly before answering. 3 months, she said. The quiet certainty of the number settled between them, and Elena saw Adrian Romano's eyes narrow just enough to reveal that the timeline had aligned perfectly with something he had already calculated in his mind. The number lingered in the quiet air between them as if it had weight. 3 months. Adrian Romano did not react immediately, but Elena could see the calculation happening behind his steady eyes. The timing matched too precisely to ignore. Lucas had disappeared almost a year ago, and if the last time Elena saw him had been early spring, then the child in her arms had arrived exactly when it should have. Adrian slowly stepped closer again, not with the threatening presence Elena had first felt when he blocked the doorway, but with the careful focus of someone examining a truth he had not expected to find. The baby stirred softly as Adrian approached, the small gray eyes blinking once under the warm glow of the library lamps. For a moment Adrian simply stood there studying the child's face, the shape of his nose, the faint curve of his eyebrows, and the quiet alertness in his expression even at such a young age. The resemblance was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence. Elena felt the tension rise inside her chest again. She had come to the mansion to work, not to become part of the private questions of a powerful family. Yet the way Adrian looked at the baby now was different from before. There was no suspicion in his gaze anymore. Instead, there was something deeper. Something thoughtful and heavy with memory. "What is his name?" Adrian asked quietly. Elena shifted the blanket gently around the baby before answering. "Noah," she said. Adrian repeated the name softly, almost as if testing how it sounded in the room. "Noah." The baby responded with a small sound, the kind that infants make when they begin to wake, but are still wrapped in sleep. His tiny fingers opened again, stretching briefly before settling against Elena's shoulder. Adrian noticed the movement immediately. The gesture reminded him of something. Lucas had done the same thing when he was thinking deeply, flexing his fingers slowly, as if measuring time in quiet moments. Adrian exhaled through his nose, a controlled breath that carried more meaning than words. "Lucas was younger than me by 6 years," he said after a moment. "He always believed he could build a different life than the one our family inherited." Elena listened carefully, surprised by how calmly Adrian spoke about a man whose absence clearly still shaped his thoughts. "He never liked the attention that came with our name," Adrian continued. "He preferred places where no one recognized him." Elena felt a small realization form in her mind. That explained why Luke had never mentioned his last name at the shelter. It explained why he had seemed so comfortable among volunteers and families who had never heard of the Romano family. To them, he had simply been another man willing to carry boxes, repair tables, and listen to people who needed help. Adrian looked once more at the baby's eyes, the same pale gray that had immediately caught his attention. "Lucas had that same color when he was born," Adrian said quietly. Elena felt her breath slow as the meaning of the conversation continued to unfold. For months, she had believed she was raising her child completely alone. The father she had known had vanished without explanation, leaving her with memories and unanswered questions. Yet the man standing in front of her now was looking at Noah, as if he were seeing part of his own family returned in the most unexpected way. Adrian finally lifted his gaze from the baby and looked directly at Elena again. His expression had changed from suspicion to something far more deliberate. "Did Lucas know about the child?" he asked calmly. The question settled heavily between them, because Elena realized the answer would reveal whether the past had been built on promises or unfinished truths. Elena felt the question press gently but firmly against her thoughts, because the truth was not something she had spoken aloud to anyone before. For months the memory had remained private, something she carried quietly while building a new life for herself and her son. She lowered her eyes toward Noah, brushing a hand softly across the blanket as she considered how to answer. The baby shifted slightly in her arms, his gray eyes half open now as he adjusted to the warm light in the library. The quiet innocence in his expression made Elena's voice softer when she finally spoke. "Yes," she said. Adrian Romano did not move, but the stillness around him sharpened instantly, as if the room itself had leaned closer to hear the rest. Elena continued slowly, choosing each word with care because the moment she described still lived clearly in her memory. "I told him a few weeks before he disappeared." The admission seemed to settle heavily into the space between them. Adrian's gaze remained steady, his attention fixed not only on her words but on the emotions behind them. Elena remembered that day with surprising clarity. It had been late afternoon at the shelter, the sun hanging low outside the narrow windows while volunteers finished organizing supplies for the evening meal service. Luke had been repairing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen when she asked if they could talk. She had not planned the conversation carefully. The words had simply come out once she realized the truth herself. Elena had expected shock, confusion, maybe even uncertainty. Instead, Luke had listened quietly while she explained, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. Adrian noticed the small shift in Elena's posture as she recalled the moment, and he remained silent, allowing the memory to unfold. "He did not look surprised," Elena said quietly. "He asked if I was sure, and when I said yes he smiled in that calm way he always had." The warmth of that memory still surprised her even now. Luke had not reacted with fear or hesitation. Instead he had taken a long breath, leaned back against the counter, and asked her about the future in a calm voice that made everything feel manageable. He said the child would grow up surrounded by kindness. Elena continued softly. He said, that mattered more than anything else. Adrian's eyes lowered briefly toward Noah again, and Elena could see the connection forming more clearly with each piece of the story she shared. He promised he would come back the next weekend, she added. He said there were things he needed to settle first. The words felt different now that she knew Luke had another name and another life waiting beyond the shelter walls. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly as he absorbed the timeline. The pieces aligned too precisely to ignore. Lucas had disappeared just days after hearing about the child. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the mansion filled the library again, while the baby stretched one small hand into the air and then rested it gently against Elena's shoulder. Adrian watched the gesture closely, the familiar movement stirring memories he had not expected to revisit tonight. Finally, he lifted his gaze back to Elena. His expression had changed again, less questioning now and more certain. Lucas knew, Adrian said slowly, as if confirming the conclusion forming in his mind. Elena nodded once. The truth was no longer something she could hold back. The man she had known as Luke had walked out of the shelter promising he would return, unaware that his life would end before he could keep that promise. Adrian Romano stood quietly in front of her, looking at the child who carried the same eyes as the brother he had lost. And in that moment the past and present seemed to meet in the small bundle resting peacefully in Elena's arms. The quiet understanding that settled in the room after Elena's words did not disappear quickly. Adrian Romano remained still for several long seconds, his attention fixed on the small child in Elena's arms, as if he were looking through the present into a memory only he could see. The resemblance was no longer something he could dismiss as coincidence or imagination. The gray eyes, the calm alertness even at such a young age, and the way the child's small fingers stretched slowly into the air before relaxing again all reminded him of the brother he had grown up beside. Lucas had always carried that same quiet steadiness, the sense that he saw the world differently from the life their family had inherited. Adrian had spent years believing that difference made his brother vulnerable. Now he realized it had simply led Lucas somewhere Adrian had never thought to look. Elena shifted her weight slightly as the baby adjusted against her shoulder, the blanket rustling softly in the warm library air. She could feel Adrian's attention following every small movement Noah made, and the intensity of that focus made her both nervous and strangely reassured at the same time. For months, she had believed she was completely alone in raising her son, responsible for every decision and every uncertain future waiting ahead. Yet the man standing across from her was now looking at Noah not as an employee's child, but as if he were seeing a piece of his own family returned in the most unexpected way. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice quiet, but carrying a deeper certainty than before. Lucas always believed that family could exist outside the world we were born into, he said slowly. I did not understand what he meant at the time. Elena listened carefully, recognizing the sincerity in his tone. She remembered Luke saying something similar one evening while they stacked donated blankets at the shelter. He had told her that kindness created its own kind of family, one built through choice rather than obligation. At the time she had smiled at the idea without realizing how much it meant to him. Adrian stepped closer again, though this time his presence did not feel like a barrier. Instead it carried a thoughtful calm, as if he were approaching something fragile rather than confronting a problem. He studied Noah once more, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly as the baby blinked up at him with quiet curiosity. Lucas would have been proud to see this, Adrian said quietly. Elena felt her chest tighten slightly at the unexpected warmth in his words. The memory of Luke's gentle smile returned again, and for a moment she imagined what he might have looked like holding his son for the first time. The thought carried both comfort and sadness, because that moment would never come. Adrian seemed to sense the same truth, because his voice lowered when he spoke again. You believed he left, he said calmly. Elena nodded slowly. I thought he changed his mind, she admitted. I never imagined anything else had happened. Adrian exhaled softly, his expression thoughtful rather than distant. Lucas did not leave by choice, he said. The statement was quiet but certain. Elena looked at him carefully, understanding that there was a larger story behind those words, one that reached far beyond the shelter and the quiet life she had known before coming to the Romano estate. Adrian glanced once more at the baby, then back to Elena, and in that moment something in his expression shifted from reflection to decision. The careful distance he had maintained since the beginning of their conversation seemed to dissolve, replaced by a calm resolve that carried the weight of responsibility. "You came here to work," he said quietly, "but it seems life had other plans." The words hung in the warm light of the library as Noah stretched his tiny hand toward the air again, completely unaware that his presence had just changed the future of everyone standing in that room. Elena felt the meaning of Adrian's words linger in the quiet library long after he finished speaking. Life had other plans. The sentence echoed softly in her thoughts because it described exactly how the past year had unfolded for her. Nothing about her life had followed the path she expected. 1 year ago, she had been a volunteer coordinator at a small neighborhood shelter, working long hours but believing the future would unfold in simple and predictable ways. Then she had met Luke. Then he had disappeared. Then Noah had arrived, bringing both joy and uncertainty into a life that suddenly felt much larger than she had prepared for. Now she stood inside one of the most powerful homes in the city while the man who owned it studied her child with the calm attention of someone who had just discovered a missing piece of his own family history. Adrian Romano did not rush the moment. He stood quietly with his hands resting at his sides, his posture straight but no longer confrontational. The sharp tension that had filled the room when he first blocked the doorway had slowly transformed into something quieter and far more deliberate. His gaze moved once more to Noah's face, watching as the baby blinked slowly and turned his head toward the warm light coming from the tall lamp beside the reading desk. The movement was small, but Adrian noticed it immediately. Lucas had done the same thing as a child whenever sunlight moved across the room, following the brightness with calm curiosity instead of restlessness. Adrian lowered his eyes slightly, absorbing the familiar detail, as if confirming what his instincts had already accepted. Elena shifted the blanket gently around Noah's shoulders, her movements careful and protective. She still did not know what Adrian intended to do with the truth that had surfaced between them tonight. The Romano family was known across the city not only for its wealth, but also for the quiet authority that surrounded its name. Elena had spent 3 months cleaning rooms in the mansion without once imagining she might become part of a conversation that touched the family itself. Adrian finally lifted his gaze back to her. The calm seriousness in his expression had deepened, but it no longer carried suspicion. Instead, it reflected a kind of responsibility that Elena had not expected to see. Lucas believed that protecting people did not always require power, Adrian said slowly. He thought kindness could do the same thing. Elena felt a small warmth rise in her chest hearing those words, because they sounded exactly like the man she had known at the shelter. Adrian continued after a brief pause. But he also believed family should never stand alone. The statement was quiet, yet it carried a weight that made Elena's breath slow. Adrian took one step closer, stopping just far enough away to keep the moment respectful. He looked down at Noah again, studying the calm child who watched him with curious gray eyes. The baby reached one small hand outward as if testing the space between them. Adrian hesitated for only a second before extending a single finger. Noah's tiny hand wrapped gently around it without hesitation. The simple contact seemed to settle something inside Adrian that words had not yet fully expressed. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The powerful man known throughout the city stood quietly, while a 3-month-old child held his finger with complete trust. When Adrian finally spoke again, his voice had changed in a subtle but unmistakable way. "Lucas may not have returned," he said quietly, "but his family clearly did." Elena looked at him carefully, realizing that the direction of this conversation had shifted again. Adrian slowly withdrew his hand, though his gaze remained on the baby. When he lifted his eyes to meet Elena's once more, the decision in his expression was unmistakable. "From this moment forward," he said calmly, "you and Noah will not face the future alone." Elena did not answer immediately after Adrian spoke those words, because they sounded too large to accept all at once. The quiet certainty in his voice carried a promise she had not expected to hear inside these walls. For months, she had prepared herself for a future built entirely on her own decisions. Every plan she made for Noah had been measured carefully. From the small apartment she rented on the edge of the city to the long hours she worked to make sure his life, would remain stable. Now the man standing across from her was calmly changing the direction of that future with a single sentence. Elena adjusted the blanket around Noah again, more out of instinct than necessity. The baby remained peaceful, his gray eyes watching the soft glow of the library lamps while his small fingers slowly opened and closed as if exploring the air. Adrian Romano observed the movement quietly, his attention steady and thoughtful. The calm connection between him and the child had settled into the room in a way that no longer felt tense. Instead, it carried a strange sense of recognition, as though the past had quietly found its way back into the present. Adrian finally stepped back slightly, giving Elena space again while he considered the next words carefully. The controlled composure he carried had not disappeared, but it now seemed guided by purpose rather than distance. "You came here to work in this house," Adrian said slowly. "And you have done that without asking for attention or favors." Elena listened carefully, unsure where the thought would lead. Adrian continued with the same quiet clarity. "For 3 months you have moved through this estate as if you expected nothing from it." Elena nodded faintly because that had been true. Her goal had always been simple: work quietly, take care of her son, and build a life that depended on no one else. Adrian looked once more at Noah before lifting his gaze back to her. "But the truth has changed that," he said. The words were spoken calmly, yet they carried a finality that made the air in the room feel heavier. Elena felt her pulse rise slightly as she waited for him to explain. Adrian walked slowly toward the large desk near the center of the library, resting one hand against the polished wood surface as he spoke again. "Lucas spent his life believing that families should be protected even when the world becomes complicated," he said quietly. "I did not always agree with the way he chose to live that belief." His voice softened slightly when he continued, "But I will honor it." Elena felt a subtle shift in the moment as those words settled into the room. Adrian turned back toward her, the quiet authority that defined him now carrying something more personal beneath it. "Noah carries the blood of my family," he said simply. The statement was direct and undeniable. Elena felt the meaning of it move through her chest like a slow realization she could no longer avoid. Adrian took a measured breath before continuing. "That means his future matters to me." The baby stretched again, his small hand brushing against Elena's shoulder while he blinked calmly at the unfamiliar voice. Adrian watched the movement with quiet focus before adding one final sentence that made the direction of the conversation unmistakable. "You will not remain only an employee in this house," he said calmly. "You and your son are now part of the responsibility my family carries." The room fell silent again after he spoke, but the silence felt different now. The future Elena had imagined only hours earlier had quietly transformed into something larger, and the powerful man standing in front of her had just made it clear that the child in her arms would never face the world alone again. Elena stood very still after Adrian finished speaking, because the meaning of his words did not settle into her mind all at once. The library remained quiet around them, the tall shelves and soft lights creating a calm that almost felt unreal compared to the storm of thoughts moving through her chest. Only an hour earlier she had walked into this room believing she was simply finishing another long day of work. Now the powerful man who owned the estate was telling her that the child in her arms belonged to his family's future. Elena looked down at Noah, as if searching his peaceful face for guidance. The baby blinked slowly and yawned, completely unaware that the world around him had just shifted in a way he could not yet understand. Adrian Romano watched the moment quietly. His posture remained composed, but there was something more thoughtful in his expression now. The decision he had spoken aloud was not a dramatic gesture or an emotional reaction. It was the kind of calm promise that carried the weight of responsibility behind it. Elena finally lifted her eyes toward him again. "Sir," she said softly, though her voice carried more uncertainty than fear now. "I never expected anything from this house except a job." Adrian nodded once, acknowledging the honesty in her words. "That is exactly why I trust what I see in front of me," he replied calmly. The answer surprised her. She had expected authority, perhaps even distance. Instead, Adrian spoke with the quiet clarity of someone who had spent years measuring people by their actions rather than their status. He stepped closer again, though this time his presence carried none of the tension that had filled the doorway earlier. His attention returned briefly to Noah, watching as the baby reached one tiny hand toward the warm light above the desk. The gesture made Adrian's expression soften slightly. Lucas had done the same thing as a child whenever sunlight crossed the floor of their childhood home. For a moment the memory returned so clearly that Adrian felt the quiet echo of it inside his chest. He had spent years believing that chapter of his life was closed. Yet here it stood in front of him in the form of a child who carried the same calm curiosity in his eyes. Adrian looked back at Elena. "You built your life expecting to stand alone," he said thoughtfully. But that was never the future Lucas would have chosen for his family. Elena felt her breath slow as she listened. Adrian continued, his tone steady and certain. "You will still have your independence. Your life will remain your own. But the responsibility of this child does not belong only to you anymore." The words carried a balance she had not expected. Adrian was not taking control of her future. Instead, he was expanding it. Elena realized that the decision he had made was not about authority, but about recognition. He was acknowledging a connection that could not be ignored. Noah stretched again, making a small content sound as his eyes drifted toward sleep. Adrian watched him carefully for a moment before speaking once more. "Lucas believed family was something you protected," he said quietly. "Tonight, I finally understand what he meant." Elena looked around the library again, the grand room that had once felt distant and unfamiliar. For the first time since she began working in the mansion, it no longer felt like a place where she was only passing through. The future she had planned was changing, not through force or demand, but through the quiet decision of a man who had just rediscovered a part of his own family in the child resting peacefully in her arms. The quiet in the library settled into a calm that felt different from the tension that had filled the room earlier that night. Elena slowly adjusted the blanket around Noah as the baby's breathing grew softer and deeper, the peaceful rhythm of sleep returning to him after the long conversation that had changed everything around him. The warm light from the tall lamps reflected faintly in the polished wooden shelves that lined the walls, giving the room a sense of stillness that felt almost reflective. Adrian Romano stood near the large desk for a moment without speaking, his gaze resting on the child, as if he were memorizing every small detail of the face that carried his brother's eyes. For years Adrian had believed that the chapter of his life that included Lucas had ended with unanswered questions and unfinished conversations. Yet now a quiet continuation of that story rested in Elena's arms, breathing softly and completely unaware of the history that surrounded him. Adrian finally stepped away from the desk and moved closer again, his movements steady and unhurried. The calm authority that had always defined him was still present, but Elena could sense something new beneath it. It was not the distant control of a powerful man protecting his position. It was the quiet determination of someone who had accepted a responsibility that could not be ignored. Adrian stopped a few feet away and looked down at Noah once more. The baby shifted slightly in his sleep, his small hand brushing gently against Elena's shoulder before settling again under the blanket. Adrian watched the motion carefully, and for a moment the faintest hint of a smile appeared at the corner of his expression. Lucas had done the same thing when he slept as a child, stretching his fingers as if reaching towards something in a dream. Elena noticed the subtle change in Adrian's face and felt a sense of calm slowly replaced the uncertainty she had carried since the conversation began. The man standing in front of her was no longer simply the distant owner of the estate. He was someone who had recognized a piece of his own family in the child she had been raising alone. Adrian lifted his gaze back to Elena. "Tomorrow morning the staff will receive new instructions," he said quietly. His tone was calm, but the certainty in his voice made it clear that the decision had already been made. Elena listened carefully as he continued. "You will no longer work in the regular rotation of the house staff. Your responsibilities will change." The words surprised her, though they no longer carried fear. Adrian noticed her reaction and spoke again with the same calm clarity. "Your focus will be Noah," he explained. "The rest of the household can manage its own routines." Elena felt the meaning settle slowly into her thoughts. For the first time since Noah was born, the long hours of balancing work and motherhood would no longer define every moment of her day. Adrian continued speaking, his attention briefly returning to the sleeping child. "Lucas would have wanted his son to grow up with stability," he said quietly. "That will begin here." Elena looked around the library again, the grand room that had once seemed distant now feeling strangely familiar. Adrian took one last slow breath before stepping back toward the doorway. His voice carried the quiet confidence of a man who had already planned the next steps in his mind. "This house has always protected its own," he said calmly. Then his eyes moved once more to Noah, the sleeping child whose presence had reopened a chapter of the past Adrian thought he had lost forever. Now it will protect him as well. The library remained quiet long after Adrian finished speaking, as if the walls themselves were absorbing the promise he had just made. Elena stood near the center of the room with Noah resting peacefully against her shoulder, feeling the strange calm that followed a moment capable of changing an entire future. The grand shelves of books, the warm amber light from the lamps, and the soft glow reflecting across the polished floor all felt different now, as if the mansion itself had quietly shifted its place in her life. Only hours earlier she had walked through these halls thinking of herself as someone passing through, an employee who would eventually leave once she saved enough money to start again somewhere else. Now the powerful man who owned the estate had made it clear that the child in her arms had already become part of the house's future. Adrian Romano paused near the doorway before leaving the library, his hand resting lightly against the frame as he turned back one final time. His gaze moved to the sleeping child, studying the calm rise and fall of Noah's breathing as if committing the image to memory. The resemblance to Lucas was no longer a question. It was a quiet certainty that had settled deep within him. For years Adrian had carried the weight of losing the one person who had believed the world could be kinder than the life their family represented. Lucas had always searched for places where people helped each other simply because they could. Now Adrian realized that search had led his brother somewhere meaningful, somewhere that had created a future none of them had expected. Elena gently shifted Noah in her arms so the blanket rested more comfortably around his shoulders. The baby did not wake, only stretching one tiny hand before settling again into sleep. Adrian noticed the movement and allowed a faint smile to appear, brief but genuine. It was the kind of quiet expression that rarely crossed his face in the presence of others. "Lucas believed the future could surprise us," Adrian said softly. His voice carried through the room with calm clarity. "Tonight, I finally understand what he meant." Elena listened carefully, sensing the deeper meaning behind his words. Adrian stepped fully into the doorway, but did not leave yet. His eyes returned once more to Noah, the child who had unknowingly restored a connection Adrian thought had disappeared forever. "This house has carried our family's history for generations," he continued quietly. "But history does not move forward unless someone new carries it with them." Elena felt the weight of the moment settle gently rather than heavily, as if the future opening in front of her was not something to fear, but something to grow into. Adrian straightened slightly, the familiar composure returning to his posture, yet the warmth in his expression remained when he looked at the baby. "Lucas gave this family something we did not know. We still had," he said. Then his gaze lifted to meet Elena's one final time. "A reason to look ahead." With that quiet sentence he turned and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the library calm and still once again. Elena remained where she stood for a moment longer, listening to the soft silence of the mansion while Noah slept peacefully against her shoulder. The path she had expected for her life had quietly disappeared tonight, replaced by something larger and far more certain. And somewhere beyond the library doors, the powerful house that had once felt distant was already preparing to welcome the smallest member of the Romano family home.